So I felt like as I was reading it, a lot of the chapters like kind of, they've a lot of the assassination attempts like sort of followed
Yeah,
same sort of blueprint in that often they would try, and they were planning to assassinate
right,
him at like a public
right,
speaking event or something like that. And then after they assassinated him, they would kind of use
right.
their contacts in these different counter-revolutionary groups to
Yeah,
incite some sort of uprising, and that would provoke the U.S. to
right.
intervene
So
militarily
I
onto the
wanna,
island.
on that point, Amanda, I wanna take a quote from this testimony of Luis Tacornal, who was involved in the Cuban state security services, but managed to infiltrate himself into a CIA operation that was trying to assassinate Fidel Castro, that was involved in Cuba. It's like in like around January of 1960, so about a year into post-revolution in Cuba, and this person Masferrer, like who was a how do we pull it? Masferrer was, let me pull up here. Roland Masferrer Rojas was a pre-revolutionary politician in Cuba, and under Batista, he ran something known as Tiger Death Squads that was responsible for killing hundreds of civilians in Cuba. Something that people love to accuse a lot of, especially Cuba, that did, but don't at all recognize what was occurring. The reality of what was occurring in Cuba before the revolution, supported by the United States. And, Matt Ferreira was explaining to this group of what he assumed were everyone were CIA agents and assets, about what was the plan regarding Cuba. And let me read the quote. It says, "Some weeks later, Matt Ferreira phoned me again at my house in Miami to explain the plans they were preparing related to an invasion of Cuba." And this is remarkable in terms of like they flat out just explain kind of what you were saying, Amanda. They believe that with State Department support, they can obtain the moral and material aid necessary for their invasion plan. At the point when they land and initiate the battle, the State Department will ask the OAS, for those who don't know, it's the Organization of American States, which is allegedly a neutral intergovernmental organization that is comprised of several countries that are in the Americas. They will ask the OAS to intervene in Cuba, backed by 6 to 8 Latin American countries. If the OAS decides to intervene in the Cuba issue, President Eisenhower will designate Admiral Burke to command troop landing operations. So see how, like, from just that small fact, they were able to kind of just just push the door open for regime change by going through yes, these are all institutions that were set up, but the whole thing is that they're going through the procedure as a means to then go to their ends of getting rid of this government. But it's important to mention that at this point in 1960, there was no explicit in this way that we now identify Cuba, but explicit mission, at least from the government, of being a communist party. And so what they were doing is just simply was like, oh, we're going to be doing some agrarian reform. We're going to try to, make the economy better for working people, for peasants, rather than simply just doing everything for these people who are creating Cuba into something that is just a fun place for Americans. And that was unacceptable to America.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. On that note, I also want to add the point that so they would create these plans to overthrow Fidel Castro, and then kind of corral in all of these other organizations. But a couple of times in the book, it was also mentioned that, after the overthrow was complete, they would
Right.
they had media contacts where they would talk to their media contacts, and they would like kind of create this
100%.
propaganda campaign that would lead people to support this regime change counter-revolution thing, right? So I wanted to read a couple of passages kind of talking about that. Okay, so I'll just read this paragraph. This is, I don't think it really matters, but this is one of the early attempts. But the conversation became quite animated as Barnes read out President Eisenhower's recent instructions to proceed with a covert operation to overthrow the Cuban government. The language was rambling, but clear enough for everyone to get a clear grasp of the strategy they were to execute: to set up a responsible and unified opposition to the Castro regime outside of Cuba, to develop mass media aimed at the Cuban people as part of a propaganda offensive, and to create a secret intelligence and action organization in Cuba to follow the instructions of the opposition in exile, and to build a paramilitary force outside of Cuba for future guerrilla actions. So this is talking about a propaganda campaign aimed at the Cuban people, which they still do.
What else is that? I think it's great you mentioned that, because like that shows like they wanted to build all this infrastructure in place to then put pressure, like you're saying, but then also if they something happened somehow happened to the people who are in charge, then now you have this infrastructure to be able to come in and be like, see, this is the legitimate government of Cuba, despite them. But also, what is interesting to say, like radio specifically. Isn't there something, if I remember correctly, something called Radio Marti?
I was just going to talk about that. So I was just going to say that this stuff didn't end in the like 50s or 60s or 70s. From 2006 to 2014, the U.S. spent over $24 million to fly a plane around Cuba and beam U.S.-sponsored TV and radio programming, including Radio Marti, to the island's inhabitants. It never worked because the Cuban government is based as fuck, and they always managed to jam its signal so no one could watch the broadcast anyway.
No, it's quite remarkable how much money they spend on this.
So I was looking at, so I have it pulled up right now. I have the NED, so a list of organizations that the NED has given a grant to in Cuba. And it's like millions of dollars. This was updated February 12th. And so I'm looking at all these organizations, and a lot of these organizations have to do with like independent media or like independent journalism. So these NGOs and organizations that are trying to develop an independent or democratic media, they're getting like hundreds of thousands of dollars in Cuba right now. Yeah.
I mean, now someone could say, well, why is it that you have such a problem with these? Why are you so opposed to the free exchange of ideas? And the reality of the situation is that although that might sound really nice in terms of like this abstract seminar you've kind of constructed in your head of, oh yeah, everyone has the same access to information and everyone considers logically, what have you. What that argument typically fails to consider is the fact of the matter is propaganda is something that is much more than just simply, people lying or simply trying to push their narrative. It is all that, but the fact of the matter too is about misconstruing the reality of what's occurring somewhere. There are aspects, for instance, that is it true that America has a higher standard of living than Cuba? That is correct in terms of a specific metric of like GDP per capita. But what those metrics tend to, when you push that kind of narrative, what then fails to capture is, for instance, like how much of that is actually going towards common people, workers. And the reality of the situation is that not very much, in the sense that, rising rents, Medicare costs are out of astronomic, whereas in Cuba, there are more doctors per capita than anywhere on earth. They have free health care. And while they are a poorer nation in terms of just raw material wealth, in terms of humane policies, if you if you take those things for granted because you just were raised in them, and then you see this kind of like this almost like a fool's gold of like, oh, look how much more your life could be. You think that could be better, but in reality, it's a trap.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. For an island that has suffered under decades of like a cruel U.S. blockade, which severely limits the like medical supplies and all kinds of things that they're able to get, they have managed to develop a state-of-the-art healthcare system where everyone has free healthcare. Like a doctor is assigned to every single person on the island, and they see their doctor regularly. And if they can't see their doctor regularly, then their doctor like actually like comes to their house and gives them a checkup and makes sure that they're doing okay. And this was part of the reason why Cuba's response to COVID was so successful, was because they already had that kind of like really good health infrastructure.
A country so immiserated that had 5 COVID vaccine candidates. That's just remarkable.
2 of which have an efficacy rate of over 90%. And not only do they have an efficacy rate of over 90%, but they're easily stored, unlike Pfizer or Moderna, which has to be refrigerated at a certain temperature. And so because of their easy like storage, it makes it a lot better for global South countries, because a lot of global South countries don't have the capacity to, like mass refrigerate a bunch of vaccines. But they cannot produce those vaccines at a mass scale because, again, they cannot get products, a lot of products to produce them on a mass scale because of the blockade. Mm-hmm. But to go back to the point about propaganda, another part of the book where they're talking about another assassination attempt, it says, when the meeting was fixed, Morales phoned the Luces, owners of Time and Life magazines, and former Ambassador William Pauly, who are all involved in the anti-Cuba crusade, and informed them of the details of the plan to assassinate Fidel, right? They would spur the mass media into a huge campaign to discredit Kennedy's policy toward Cuba, and would use their influence in the Republican Party to support the latest organization of Cuba exiles, the JGCE, as a viable structure for the next government in Cuba when Castro was defeated. So here it is, the ruling class working hand in hand, the capitalist government of the United States planning to overthrow Castro, and then calling their contacts in the media so that the media can sort of shape this narrative that's coming out of Cuba.
Then becomes manufactured, if you will.
Yeah. So I think if you read this, you cannot help but at least look at U.S. media coverage of Cuba in a totally different light, especially with regard to what was going on last July I think in Cuba.
What you just mentioned, Amanda, is like such a incredible revelation, because if you're just looking at it from a purely legalist, institutionalist point of view, here you have a intelligence services that's supposed to be a independent agency, but an agency nonetheless that is formally subsumed of the executive branch of the U.S. government, who was at that time led by the democratically elected president of John F. Kennedy. And here you have a coordinated effort by this subordinate agency intentionally trying to undermine the policy of their superior that was democratically elected. These people are not democratically elected. CIA, people who are in charge of CIA, are not put there by the people of America, and these decisions are not decided on democratically, right? So here you are, just like you're looking at it from purely the logic of like the system of like formally of the American governmental system. Even on that basis, it's you see how much of a rogue agency the CIA is in terms of like just intentionally trying to undermine, what's meant to be the policy of the president, because it does not fit their internally decided goal of regime change.